All right, we're back and we are live. Once again, this is the Looking for Work. So we do this every week, Tuesday, 12 o'clock Pacific. Jump online, answer questions from the community. So if there is anybody there, hello, shalom. Please feel free to drop some questions in the chat. I usually spend just a few minutes talking about sort of a topic that I think is important. Shalom wants to talk about the portfolio. I like that. I can definitely cover that. And basically, once we dive in, talk about a topic or two of interest, then we'll just start answering questions. Rip through as many of those questions as we can. I'll stay all the way until 1 o'clock if we have questions. So that's kind of the deal. So we're simulcasting across Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Periscope, and Twitch. So in any of those platforms, if you just leave a comment, that should fire off the question to me, and then I'll just answer them. So one thing that I thought might be really good, I'll probably touch on this again a little bit tonight at the San Diego JavaScript meetup, and that is the three, or I guess maybe the 4 C's to resumes. And I think this also applies to portfolios, so I can kind of lump them two together and say that there's 4 key things, 4 C's that you want to be looking at. The first is contact info. So just make sure it's super easy for people to find you. When you're sending out your resume, there's nothing worse than wanting to get a hold of somebody, then looking and seeing like they only left an email and they didn't give a phone number. Super big pro tip, always use a burner phone number, use like a Google Voice number. That way, as soon as you get a job, you won't have to have phone calls from recruiters for like the next however many years you're going to be alive. Because as soon as you put your resume out there with the phone number, recruiters are going to call you constantly. So I would use a burner phone number for when you're not actively seeking. That way you don't have to just get lots and lots of phone calls. I'd say as a senior software engineer, when my resume is out there, it's been a while since I've had a resume out there floating around, but I'd get like 2-3 calls a day from recruiters. With just random, like, hey, you want a new job? Like, no, thanks. But that said, you probably haven't experienced that as an early career developer, and so it's not a genuine fear, but trust me, it is real. So use a burner phone number, but supply your contact info so people know how to get a hold of you. The second is focus on consistency. So if you want to use, bold font face, you want to use a certain type of styling, just be consistent about it. I try and focus on having maybe 2 versions of your resume, one that's really good for any of the automated systems, so you can get through the automated screening process. And then you may want to have a little bit fancier one that looks nice and polished if you're a front-end engineer, so that you can kind of show that you have some design chops and it looks really compelling, it looks nice. That doesn't mean put your picture on it. It just means make sure that it looks sort of very visually appealing, which is different than the resume that you might need for the automated resume screening tools. So consistency is the key with that. Don't have one half of it styled one way and another. Don't have jagged margins. Make sure everything's lined up. It's those little things. It's that fit and finish, attention to detail that I'm looking for as a hiring manager if you're sending me a resume. In my opinion, a resume is never going to win you a job, but you can definitely lose an opportunity to go in and interview because your resume just isn't contact information, some consistency to it. The third is compelling. This is your calling card. This is how you demonstrate that you've got the skills and the ability to make a coherent argument as to why you're the best candidate for the job. And then that fourth piece is code. Show me where I can find and see some of your code, or what you've written, what kind of code, what kinds of technology that you are really good with. So if you can provide all 4 of those pieces and a great, tight 1 or 2 page document, awesome. That'll get you by that first phase, which is like the screening. Like, do we even want to have a conversation, a 10-minute conversation with this person? So to go one step further, when we look at the portfolio, we could apply those same things. When I look at someone's portfolio, I want it to be super clear. How do I get a hold of this person? Next, is there a way for me to easily see whatever the pattern is, right? Some people like to have like a single page portfolio where everything's on one page, and you might have some like auto scroll features that scrolls you to different parts of the page, but it's just a simple Maybe details about an individual project are on a second page, but for the most part, everything's just sort of like laid out, super easy. You want to have some sort of a narrative about your projects. Like, are all of the projects in one genre? Are these all passion projects? Let's make sure that they're not just ride-alongs. So don't go buy a Udemy course and then build a project from the Udemy course and then put that on your portfolio. That's a terrible idea. I can smell those projects a mile away as a hiring manager. And just to take a step back, I've been writing software for a really long time, about 32 years writing software, but I've hired lots and lots of engineers. I've trained lots of engineers and gotten folks into entry-level roles at really big companies like IBM Red Hat, Deloitte, Walmart Labs, Sony, all the way down to really small, super amazing shops. Like, shout out to the folks over at Trust and Will. Got a few folks over there at that shop. Mind Touch, like just a bunch of places, Ezoic. So I can tell you hands down, when I talk to hiring managers, they consistently are looking for certain attributes. And on a portfolio, one of the things they're looking for is just like, show me what you're capable of doing. Where's the code? What's the skill set that you have? Are you passionate about coding? And if so, they want to have conversations all day, every day. They'll want to have conversation with you and see if you're a good fit. So that portfolio is it's definitely way stronger than your resume. If you're a entry level, early career software developer, you will be able to more vividly describe your passion for coding by demonstrating your work on a portfolio as compared to your resume, which frankly, in many cases, is just going to have a description of a few of your projects and a link to your portfolio, right? If you're doing it right. So hopefully that's helpful from Ohio. Shalom. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct as well. My guess is that's shalom. But so Henry asked a question: for junior full stack front end or back end role, how important do you consider DevOps? That's a good question. I think it's good to know how to at least get your application out there onto a server. I don't think you need to have a deep knowledge for you to be prepared for an entry level role. But I also think it is incumbent upon you to go beyond just saying, well, it works on my laptop, or here's where my code is, and you can pull it down and run it locally. I think you need to at least demonstrate that you know some way to get your code up and on the web and somewhere where people can work on it or take a look at it. Because otherwise, it's a big gap for you to really maybe not understand, like, what's the request and response cycle on a production server? What are some of the issues like around cores and not knowing that you can get your app deployed makes me then wonder, like, are you going to struggle with some of those other issues that are really foundational? So just being able to get it up, great. I don't think you need to know how to do like infrastructure as code. I don't think you need to know anything super fancy like containerization, Kubernetes, anything along those lines. But I do think it's important to be able to deploy your code somewhere where it's live on the internet. And I think it's helpful to start with some really basic, sort of like the traditional way that we might deploy an application to the web, which is to go into like Amazon and spin up an EC2 instance and put Nginx or Apache on it, and then just host the files and be able to let people hit the server and make it respond back. On the other hand, I think it's also very useful for you to understand 12-factor design patterns and be able to use a platform as a service like Now or Heroku and be able to just push and get your code deployed and know some of the checkpoints that you need to go along the way to make sure the code's actually alive and it's working well. So Netlify, right? So being able to deploy and use something like Netlify, I think, is hands down the minimum that you should have if you want to be able to like say, hey, I'm ready for an entry level role. Got lots of questions today. That's awesome. So Edward asks, what's my go-to introduction request email when I'm trying to connect through a secondary point of contact? Good. So I don't know that you're gonna have it's a really great idea. I wasn't supposed to say have success, but a really great idea to try and basically say, hey, Edward, you're connected to this other person I'd like to talk to. Is there any way you could make an introduction? I think you are gonna have to spend a little bit more time maintaining a relationship with someone if you want them to give you access to their network. Because I'd be like, if someone reached out to me, I'd be like, I don't know you, fool. I'm not introducing you to somebody else. Like, you have to present a compelling reason. So I think it's possible, but not very practical for you to just immediately contact someone in your network and ask them to introduce you to somebody else. It's more helpful if you have a genuine relationship with that secondary point of contact, and you can say, hey, I'm super interested in applying for this role, and I think you're connected to someone at this organization. Is there any way that you'd be willing to do a soft introduction and just sort of like let me, connect with this individual that you're connected with? And I think if your person that you're connecting with knows you and has a relationship and you've developed that, then it'll be really easy for them to introduce you. And that could be awesome, because now it's not like you introducing yourself to an organization, it's someone kind of socially vouching for you. So I would say first develop the relationship with your connect, and then it should be really easy to just have a very simple conversation like, hey, I'm really interested in a role at this organization. I'd love to get to know some of the folks that work there. Is there any way you could introduce me to X, Y, or Z person? So hopefully that helps. Yeah. So Edward just said, after you've built a relationship. So that's it. Like, just this is easy. Don't set up barriers. This is very conversational. Like, be very clear with what your goal is, which is you want a job in the organization and you're interested in a role that they have there, or you're interested in creating a role and saying, hey, this is a company I love to work at. They don't have any roles, but I'd love to just like start getting to know people there and see like what it would take for me to be ready for a role there. So like that. Hey, Gabriel, thanks for jumping on. Hopefully this will be helpful for you. Job Hackers. Oh, Job Hackers. That's Larry's group. So Larry's group, Job Hackers, looks like they've got a link that's in the blog here, or in the stream here. Check them out if you're interested in like Agile and Scrum. They have a great training program. So Job Hackers, great organization. So what about taking a Udemy course and demonstrating understanding by really owning it, putting in documentation comments? Nope, sorry. So I get the gist, like, but I think you're like slapping jelly on the biscuit, and it's like, I don't really want someone to like slap jelly on a biscuit. I would much rather, you don't even have to build anything as comprehensive as what you took a course for. I would much rather you say, here's a novel solution to a problem that I was trying to solve, right? So I'll give you a scenario, because people are always like, well, what's a passion project? Like, how do I pick passion projects? I would say try and pick a passion project that is something you can complete in 2 to 3 days max. Don't take on portfolio projects and passion projects that are going to take you a really long time. And a course is probably like too much. It's probably too much covered in that course for it to be super valuable. And instead, I would say pick something narrow and then try and execute in 3 or 4 days. And the reason for that is because, like, if you pick anything more than that, it's going to be riddled with bugs and defects. You're going to keep wanting to add features to it. It'll have things that don't work. It'll have things that are great, but it's just like, it's usually a hot mess. If you pick something small, you can focus on making it really, really tight. Then you can make your code look real clean. You can visually represent it with all your favorite CSS tricks and make it look super nice on the front end and a super good polished UI. And then you can get it to your GitHub and you can set up continuous deployment. To Henry's point, you can show how you get it up and you get it deployed, and a few little tricks to get the application to be kind of like using the best standards and best practices. And instead of stretching out yourself thin, you end up really being able to showcase your whole variety of skills at a really high polished level. It's not the same as like taking a existing project and just like doing some bolt-ons and like adding a couple of nice little bells and whistles and a couple of customizations and customizing a little bit here and there. It's not that that's going to be harmful for your portfolio. It's just I can smell that a mile away, and that to me is far less interesting than if you came and you said, hey, I ride a lot, and so because I ride my bike a lot, I want to incentivize myself to like get on streaks and ride for like 5 days in a row. So I'm going to use the API, and I'm going to hit the API for like Strava, and for every day where I hit it, I went on a ride and it exceeded 5 miles or 10 miles or whatever, then I'm going to give myself like a little green check mark, and I'm just going to have a dashboard, and the dashboard will just be updated in real time. As soon as I finish a ride, I get a little check mark, right? And then, you can pull in other things, like maybe the Strava API allows you to pull in some pictures from the ride or some stats from the ride, display that all on a leaderboard page. That could be the same underlying skills that you learned in that Udemy course, But notice how everything is different because it's focused on a real problem and how you might actually implement whatever the pattern is, rather than doing the course as a ride along and then trying to like just add a couple customizations to it. So it has to start fundamentally from like an interesting thing you're really trying to build an application to solve, because that's what I want to see. I want to see that passion. I want to see the ability for you to connect a problem or your solution with a problem. And it's not about the implementation of the code. Those details are not nearly as important. Lexius Walter, I know Lexius. Great to see you online. Question is, in addition to the portfolio, do you have any tips for grooming and organizing your GitHub repo to best showcase your work? Yes, I do. Thanks for dropping in. Appreciate the support. What I would suggest is, first and foremost, you can actually make some of your repositories private if they are not like the best of your work. If they're just stuff that you fork it because you're like, oh, this is a really cool repository, I'm going to fork this, and maybe at some point in the future I'll contribute to it. You can go ahead and hide those. You can make those private so that they don't show up. So the first thing is just like cleaning up what's shown. You can remove things from your GitHub. So if you think, well, I don't really want to make this private and it's just kind of cluttering, you can delete it. Remember, if you check it out locally, you'll have a local version. If you check it out to more than one device, you'll have a backup version of it, right? Or you could check it out and you could put it on a Dropbox. So I would really go through the process of getting rid of the ride-alongs, getting rid of any of the exercise practice files, things like that, and instead just showcase what are the projects that you're most impressed with, and then go through and make sure that you have a README document for each of those projects that describes what it is that it does. And then most importantly, if it's public, if someone were to check out this repository, how would they spin it up and get it running? And how would they validate it's running correctly and it's doing what it's supposed to do? Sometimes we think because we're working on something, it's like super intuitive because of the name of your project for people to use it. But can't tell you how many times senior engineers just throw code up there with no README and you have no idea what is this application supposed to do. And you have to dig through the code to figure out like, okay, what is this supposed to perform or produce, or what's the purpose of it? So just making it like super clear. And it seems like kind of dumb, but it's really important, because when people look at your projects from the outside, they're not going to know why, this project requires these dependencies, or you have to set these environment variables. And it's not super obvious from people from the outside. So really take time to make those README documents look really nice. And then if you want your portfolio and your GitHub to really shine, here's the tip. Pro tip, get badges, right? Get badges that show that your repository's code is tested, or that it's linted, or that it's deploying safely if it's being deployed on continuous deployment. Like that's a polishing detail that right away tells me, okay, this person's paying attention and they're actually like setting up continuous deployment. Because it might not be obvious if this application is live somewhere. Putting a link to the live application in your README document. Things like that are going to take your GitHub to the next level. You can also use GitHub Pages to host your portfolio. So there's a real simple hosting solution for you. So those are some great ways where you can really showcase that you are following best practices and, somebody that just kind of knows their stuff, right? Those are unusual things for people that are self-taught or going through a boot camp to really master. So if you want to set yourself aside or above the rest of your cohort and people that are just like self-learning, really make sure that your GitHub repos all have decent README documents with like all of those features I talked about, and you're going to hands down separate yourself from everybody else. That's easy stuff, right? This is like the donut trick. Everybody should be doing it. So Edward asks, at what point when you've been brought into a company and you've built cred to suggest taking on something like continuous integration or deployment? I'd say it's okay. It's safe to do it like right away. As soon as you understand how the infrastructure works, then I would ask, hey, is it okay if I have access to this? Is it okay if I spend a little bit of time and set this up so that we'll be in a situation where we can kind of like rapidly iterate? It also might mean that you have to like maybe make some adjustments and make sure the code has tests, because otherwise there's no real value to having something like continuous integration unless you've got good, at least some smoke tests. And then the other piece that you should be wary of is that they may have had some prior experience. So just be aware that when you start talking about continuous deployment, many shops might freak out because they'd say, we do not want to have that happen. And then what you can do is suggest that, well, maybe there are some ways that we can automate getting this tested and get the integrations working in the background on like a staging environment, or just testing our code and getting it, the plumbing set up, and being very clear, instead of it automatically deploying, making it a last manual thing that someone has to do. So someone still has to like push a button, click a lever, do something to trigger the final push. That's the part where even really good shops sometimes get a little anxious about just automatically deploying something if all the tests pass. You still want to have some levers in place, unless you've got a really, really well designed, thought out, and planned process to deploy and fail forward or roll back, right? So just be aware that when you bring up the conversation, be ready to have the complete conversation, not just like, hey, I'm interested in setting up Circle CI, or I'm interested in setting up Travis. Be prepared to open up that Pandora's box and at least be able to have conversations about those next couple of things that will usually be the fear for a lot of people, which is that you're automatically you're gonna push something to master and it's going to deploy and it's going to break a whole bunch of stuff in production, right? So make sure you're ready for that objection, and I think you're good to go. You do it right away. Say, hey, is it okay for me to like work on this as a little side, little passion project for the office? See what they say. Nice. So I got the shalom correct. Edward also asked, have I heard anything positive or feedback about the more general boot camps, product schools, Scrinboard? Okay. The general feedback I can give you about boot camps are that there are some good ones out there. The vast majority of them are not great. So you will always get out of that experience what you put into it. So even if you don't go to a great program, if you are a coder, you're going to do fine. If you are not what I call a coder, someone that likes to write code, you are passionate about it, and if you had some spare time you would prefer to actually learn or research or write some code, you'll probably be fine no matter what school you go to. The experience will be different. So there'll be schools where you have a better experience than others. But generally speaking, I'd say there are a lot of schools that are not good. The bigger programs, the ones that have multiple campuses, not good. Most of the ones that are in multiple sites, not good. It's really hard. The business is really hard. And so it's hard to run a good program and scale it. Most of the ones on university campuses, not good. So if you're thinking about one that's run through like a local university, probably would steer clear of that. There are some that are really good. So Hack Reactors program for a long time has been really good. The folks at Zip Code Wilmington, real good. Sabio up in LA, real good. Codesmith in LA, real good. There's a handful of them that are real good programs. And there is a CIRR, like reporting consortium that you can use to look at outcomes. And so I'd base your decisions on the outcomes. The ones that have the better outcomes, they're better schools. The ones that don't report outcomes at all, like the ones on university campuses, I'd steer clear of because they're not transparent about their outcomes. So the positive thing is there are some good programs out there. I'm not a huge fan of like programs that are run that don't lead directly to job opportunities. So I would focus on like what are the skills that you need to acquire the entry-level job that you're looking for, and then see, are there programs out there that have demonstrated outcomes that lead to people successfully getting jobs? And that's how I would evaluate the programs first and foremost. And then it's about like, do you like the instructors on the campus? You get a chance to meet the instructors, all those good things before you actually decide to invest in that program. So at a high level, I mean, I can talk about boot camps all day because I've been in the space for about 5 years, so I have strong opinions. But I'd say in general, that's a pretty good rule of thumb to use. It's just like, make sure you understand what they're reporting in terms of their outcomes data, and then talk to a few recent grads and see what the grads have to say about the program. Next question, how do I respond to a hiring manager, or have I heard anything positive about some of the more general? Okay, so this is more of like from a hiring manager's perspective. Some hiring managers hate code boot camps. So they've had bad experiences, and for whatever reason, they've decided that because they've had a bad experience or a few bad experiences, they're just going to write off the whole thing, which kind of doesn't make sense, because it's like if you had a bad experience with a piece of technology that you'd never use that technology again. It's like, well, maybe it wasn't the right fit for that particular use case. So I would say that said, those organizations are going to probably be very difficult for them to be good stepping stones. But there are plenty of small organizations that are fine with them. And so, again, it's really going to vary. And it's going to be very anecdotal until you have like a significant number of people that have run through a program. Shalom. I'm getting good questions from a bunch of people. So I like this. I like to start writing a project README before writing code. I agree. It's good to at least like get it in there, get it checked in, and have a basic general sense of like, this is what we're working on. Here's maybe even some to-do items, and give yourself a little roadmap of what you're going to build out. I think that's awesome. We're getting close to the end of the question. So if anybody else has additional questions, please feel free, drop them in the chat box. I do this every Tuesday, so more than happy to be a resource here to answer your questions about all things related to landing your first job in tech. Edward also asked, do I notice when a portfolio project is written with test-driven development or BDD as base? Not necessarily. It's tough to do. So BDD is a little easier to do than test-driven development. But irrespective, I kind of do a hybrid. And for a lot of projects, especially when you're working on your own passion projects, you might find that test-driven development is kind of restrictive, and it might be easier to build small features. And then after you built the feature, then go back and write tests to make sure it's testable, and then you've got good coverage, and then keep iterating. Because you might find that there's a lot of like throwaway code, and that if you're writing the test first, there could just be much longer cycles. And when you're trying to do like a 2 or 3 day project, it just may not be it may not be the strength and the best way to get to an MVP to be writing a ton of code, a ton of tests for your code. Now, I do agree that having test coverage is a great way to signify the quality of your code. And if you are not writing tests before you write code, you should write tests after you write the code. All I'm suggesting is that you might need to do some iterations, and it might make sense for you to like dial it in your passion project first, and then write supporting code, and then make sure your tests red, green, they can fail. Then you fix the code and it passes and you're good to go. Then you have the ability to go back and make some adjustments to your code in like 6 months when you decide to add a couple new features to your little app, and you won't have to worry about breaking the app, right? So you get some regression testing capability by just adding the test afterwards. But when I look at people's projects, I'll look to see, do they have a test folder, and I'll look to see what kind of coverage they have, and if they are like actually documenting, and maybe even have a badge that says, like 90% code coverage. That'd be awesome, because that shows me that you know how to use a tool like Istanbul or CodeCov. It shows that you took the time to write tests. It shows that you have a good understanding of how to write code that is testable. So it does demonstrate a lot of skills if I see that the tests are there, but I can't really tell whether or not you wrote the test before you wrote the code or the test after you wrote the code, which I think is the like meat of the question when you say test-driven development. There are some shops that like preach test-driven development. I'm not super dogmatic, no matter what people might argue. I have things that I have strong opinions, but I'm not real dogmatic about things like, should you write your test before or after? Edward asks, is it common in an interview to be asked about what you would do about technical debt? It might be. It might be interesting to hear what a candidate's perspective is. I definitely wouldn't ask a junior engineer that. So if you got that question, I think they would be better served to ask a question like, do you understand, or can you explain to me what your understanding of technical debt is? Then it would be to say, I'd like you to address the technical debt that we have. That's a big task for like a senior engineer, let alone a junior. So if you're in the early part of your career and they're asking those kinds of questions, you might be in over your head, right? Because that's not a junior engineering question. So I would say it is not common to be asked about something like that for a entry level role, because it's like that's more of like you got to understand the whole kit and caboodle where you're walking in to understand like how to address technical debt. So for those of you that have not heard that term before, what technical debt is referring to are deferred work and tasks that you are sort of like temporarily shoving out of the way, knowing that you will have to address at some point in the future. So anytime you create a workaround and like, hey, we're going to go back and we're going to finish this later, but let's just set it aside here for now. If it has to be addressed at some point in the future, that is what we would then call technical debt. It's a debt that you have to repay at some point. And if you get to the point where you have so much debt that you can't work on anything new because all you have to do is fix this, then you're essentially bankrupt. You essentially are at the point where you can't build any new features because you've got so much that you have to fix and that's broken. So not a good thing. So if they ask about technical debt, I think it's important to recognize as a junior engineer that you want to build things of high enough quality and you don't want to introduce things that will cause you to have to go back and do more work later on. So in that regard, I do think it's important, but I think solving existing technical debt that an organization has when you first come on board is like not something that I think I would have great answers for as a junior engineer. So Edward also asks, what is the most important thing to do in a whiteboarding part of an interview? Talk. So that's the one that some people just did not get. I am thrilled when someone starts with asking me questions so that they can really understand the constraints of the problem. They can restate the problem so that they're articulating what their understanding of what it is that they're working on. Just talking and communicating the thought process. The second most important thing to do is to draw or diagram out your thought process, because what you're trying to do during this part of an interview is you're trying to explain how you think and how you solve problems, not how you solve this problem. And it's really, really important. I know that the pressure is on in an interview and people want to be successful. So they think like, I really want to make sure that I get the code right and that I answer this in such a way. But it's like way more about showing your work than it is about getting, the number 42 to come out of the problem. And that's because I want to, when I'm evaluating a candidate during a whiteboarding interview, I want to figure out if they get stuck, how do they get unstuck? If they are architecting something, then I would say, okay, are they making reasonable assumptions? Are they thinking about corner cases and edge cases? How do they attack the problem? All of those kinds of things. It's not nearly as much about, do they pick the perfect algorithm, right? Not for a junior engineer. So most important thing, talk. More important than getting the right answer. So, no problem, Edward. Appreciate you joining and asking your questions. Basically, based on my experience, the best way to address technical debt is to gather and analyze fresh requirements, refactor, thoroughly document the code, create an epic. Again, none of that is really for a junior engineer. So it's not really a great candidate assessment question. If you're more a senior engineer and they were specifically bringing you on as part of the team to help reduce their technical debt and bring some best practices, and maybe you're going to be part of like a senior or a core member of a team that is brought in to address this issue, then sure, they might be fair to ask those questions. They might recognize that like that's an area they got to get better in, and they want to bring you in to help with that. Yeah, anybody that is asking that of a junior engineer is probably, I would agree, Shalom, not a great question from a hiring manager's perspective for a junior engineer. And that's a good point to recognize that like when you're at an interview, it's you interviewing them as much as it's them interviewing you as a fit for the job. And if I were asked questions like that, I would be so uncomfortable as a junior engineer that it'd be like, this does not seem like the right environment for me. So it doesn't seem like it's a very inclusive and welcoming question. Doesn't seem grounded in like relevancy to what your role will be on the team, unless they're literally hiring a junior engineer to work on their technical debt, which is possible. But I don't think they should be asking you for the strategy around that. I think they should just be showing you the backlog and asking you, do you think you can handle these tickets? Right? And then telling you, here's the bugs, here's the features, this is the order we'd like you to try and fix them in. So Lexius asks a question, as a junior front-end developer, what computer science concepts do I think will be important to have a basic understanding of? Not many. So data structure and algorithms, you're certainly going to need to understand some of the like foundational data structures, like you want to understand like a tree-like structure. And so, what is a binary tree? Might be helpful to know. It might be helpful to know things like when we talk about key values, pairs, and stores. We talk about concepts like object-oriented programming, so different programming styles or paradigms. That could be important as a computer science concept. So data structures like linked lists and trees and key value pairs, some styles, and maybe even some patterns, like a pattern like the singleton pattern, or something like dependency injection. Those would be concepts that are good to have a basic understanding of, right? So you might not be great at talking about like dependency injection, or they might say, can you explain what inversion of control is? And you're like, what does that mean? Just a fancy way of saying dependency injection. And then someone might be like, well, I've never even heard of dependency injection. Well, look it up. And then you'll be prepared for those kinds of questions. It's a common pattern that's used, and it's like one of the reasons why people pick certain languages and frameworks, like Angular. People say Angular is very testable code because they use a lot of dependency injection, which basically means that you pass a bunch of arguments into a function in order to make sure that in the future, when you want to test that function, you can pass in mock objects. You don't have everything kind of like in JavaScript, everything inside of like a closure, right? So these would be things that you want to make sure that you kind of have a fundamental understanding of, and just be aware that they'll call it two different things. They'll either call it inversion of control or dependency injection. So it's got two names that we use for it. But then more importantly, understand, generally what it is, and generally why do we use it? We use it in JavaScript because otherwise it'd be really hard for us to test our functions. But if we use dependency injection when we write our functions, it'll be easy for us to pass in mock objects and then test our functions with mock objects instead of functions inside of functions, which are really hard to test. That also helps them to understand when you explain it that way, oh, you understand how to write testable code and how to use a pattern like the dependency injection to make sure that you have more lines of your code that are covered with tests than somebody that has no idea what that means. And they have no idea why someone would even use that pattern. And you look at a function and you look at all these arguments that are being passed in, and you're like, why are they passing all these arguments? Why don't they just put that function inside of that other function? Like, because of closures, knucklehead. So that's the reason. Andrew, great suggestion. Big O notation, understanding what the size and complexity and being able to communicate that in some way, really important. So no, when they start asking, I had a knucklehead once who's taking a practice interview, and he's practicing with like Microsoft. It wasn't a real interview with Microsoft. This is a practice interview. And they asked him a question about increasing the size of like the amount of data. So like, let's say instead of me giving you a function that had 8,000 records, it had like 8 million records. How would that change how long it takes for the application to run? And so instead of him referencing Big O and saying, well, that would change the time complexity and that would give it an O signature of, right? Instead, he was like, well, I think the computer is pretty fast, and so I think it'll just be able to be done in just a little bit longer, like maybe a fraction of a second. And I'm just like, oh, bro, he's asking about Big O. He's just not using those words. So you want to be prepared for, variations of that too. They might not ask you directly, like, what's the Big O signature of this function or your solution, your algorithm, but they may ask you for something like that, like, how much time do you think it would take to run that function? And then you might say like, oh, it's like O of n. It's like constant, or it's like, I don't know, something else. So depends on the algorithm. Different algorithms have different efficiency in terms of time and space complexity. So that's a great one, Andrew. That's why you are a baller software engineer. Are there any red flags that I would commonly see on job listings, specifically for junior roles? Sure. I mean, I think the common thing I think a lot of companies want to communicate is that this is not like a super entry-level role, like no experience is required. And instead, they go too aggressive and they're like, must have 2 years of progressive experience using X, Y, and Z technologies. And even though they're a wish list, the wish list is so random skills and backgrounds that people look at it and they're just like, I don't want to apply for that because it just seems like I don't qualify for most of those things. So I think the biggest mistake that they make, and that people should be recognizing when you're applying for jobs is it's just a wish list. And so sometimes they get a little aggressive in their desires, and they're looking for this unicorn, or otherwise sometimes we call them purple squirrels. And it's like, they don't exist. And instead, use it as a like, okay, would I feel like I could come in, ramp up with an organization, learn their business, and be productive in a few months? And if so, great. If you feel like if you got the job, you would really struggle and it would be really, really difficult for you to keep up, it's probably over your head and probably not something that you're going to be super successful in. And assume that they're not going to be able to give you a ton of support and sort of carry you. So that's not a great fit. If it feels like I can do this, take me a couple months to get in there and understand everything, but I'd be pretty good at this. Apply for the job, right? That's the issue I usually see in job listings. They're asking for like sort of a ridiculous laundry list of experience for the more entry level roles, and they may say like looking for a junior engineer with 4 years experience. I'm like, that's not a thing, because when you have 4 years experience, you're not a junior engineer anymore, right? So like that's sort of like the nonsense that you see sometimes is the biggest red flag. That tells me that there's a disconnect there and they may not have it together. So it's a big red flag. All right. Yeah, I agree, Shalom. Language that hit the ground running, pivot quickly, those are usually language that's used for describing a senior engineer, right? And that's a lot of times when people say, well, how do you know when you're a senior engineer? When words like that don't scare you. When you feel like you can demand a senior engineer salary, that's when you know you're a senior engineer. When you work on features on your own, you're autonomous and don't have to rely on a lot of other engineers to get all of your work done, that's when you're a senior engineer. Those are the types of questions that you should not be getting as a junior. And those should be red flags that like, okay, this is not a great role for me. So any other questions? These are good ones. I'm seeing a lot of really good feedback today. Great participation. So I'd love to see that. This has been a fun one. Man, I gotta invite Shalom and Edward more often to the party because y'all were slamming today. I like it. Anybody else have any questions? It's kind of slowed down a little bit. So unless I have additional questions, I'm going to end it here. All right. If anybody does have any other questions, feel free. You can send me an email, mike@sdcs.io. And again, if you're interested in learning more about the apprenticeship program, the website is actually, you don't have it without the W's. You could just go to sdcs.io. You don't even have to put the W's in there. So HTTPS, secured, and then sdcs.io. All right. Peace. See you next week.